My name is James Artis, as you know. A little bit background about me. I am 20 years Army, retired, logistics and supply chain, so don't hold it against me. I started my career working in a warehouse, actually, and then kind of went into managing warehouses, designing warehouses, and then I kind of switched over to the supply chain side, where I was, took an assignment as a Defense Intelligence Agency's logistics branch chief down in San Antonio. And then toward the end of my career, I worked in acquisition and cross-service agreements, where I kind of got my introduction into SCRIM, but it was more of supply chain insurance at the time, where we was working on logistic operations and services that didn't have contracts attached to them. So basically, the premise was to make sure that we brought quality products into the warfighter. Once I retired, I took over as the Director of Supply Chain Risk Management for the National Reconnaissance Office, the NRO. From there, I kind of was offered to teach here at AFIT from a guy named Matt Sampora. So he came from AFIT to the NRO, kind of liked the idea. So I'm at AFIT now, and I'm also Due Hatton, where I am the Director of Supply Chain Risk Management for GDIT. So, and then on top of that, me and John also have a commercial service that we do for a company called Chain, where we do supply chain risk assessments for certain entities. So that's a little bit of background about me. I'll keep it nice, short, and sweet, and I'll turn it over to John.
Hello, I'm John Bommer. I'm a 20-year retired Lieutenant Colonel in the United States Air Force, cybersecurity SME. So the reason why I talk about that as being cybersecurity SME, I was one of the initial people within the Air Force Computer Emergency Response Team that operated out of AIA in San Antonio and AFIWC. After instantiating that, I also went on to do air traffic control and landing systems with the military. But after that, not only did I do the National Military Command Center, where I worked command and control, but I also was the squadron commander as we stood up the US.AF.mil. I was Sentinel 1 when we went from instantiating having 3 gateway constructs to now what everybody operates under within the Air Force, 386 different sites, 16 gateways, and actually managed that to become the 26th Network Operations Squadron, which it controls the US.AF.mil DoD construct. So with that being said, I was managing our supply chain as well as guiding the operations and how we looked at the equipment, and actually was one of the first ones to get 100% grade using the DISA standard of SIPRNet and NIPRNet. And as we went forward, went from that movement from 3 to 7 initial operational capability to a full span operational capability in less than 18 months under my command. Went from there to AFIT, where I did the CCR, instantiated cyber in 200 and 300, where we looked at the different spectrums of things that were going on. And then due to medical things, I retired, went to law school, but something was calling me back. So AFIT, LS brought me back to instantiate cybersecurity the way that I was thinking it should be in the acquisition process, and for me to highlight some of those acquisition things that goes hand in hand with the deciphering of the supply chain. With that being said, James and I operating, I act right now as the CSCRIM expert for not only what we do at AFIT, but also under our company of Chain. But as well, I am on the G32 committee that actually looks at cyber physical systems, system engineering plan, and I'm on the subcommittees for hardware, software, and the CPS obligations that we're looking at in building that. So those are my credentials and background, and we're currently working supply chain issues. Thanks.
Absolutely. So again, thank you, everyone. Quick notes. I know we do got a Q&A for 30 minutes at the end. So I will kind of, once I get rolling, I get rolling. So if you do have a question, I don't mind you interrupting, just raise your hand or, just break in and I'll try to look at it. I got the chat up as well. So if I see that there's a question in the chat that you would like for me to address, then, feel free, we'll tackle it as we go. So I'm gonna share my screen right now. And JD, I'm gonna try to stay towards the outline that you got in email.
Okay.
All right. All right, let's see if I can get this a win this time. All right, can everybody see my screen?
You good to go, James?
Good to go. All right.
Yep. Might want to put it in presentation mode though.
Yeah. It's MS Teams.
Oh, okay.
All right. So we're gonna kind of go through the presentation and kind of what we teach here at AFIT, and then kind of keep that continuity going, and then we'll kind of go over some key areas within Scrim, and then we'll answer your question. So cost of class is unclassified. The discussion goes up to everything unclassified. And then the purpose is just to kind of identify the information in the environments on how to protect your supply chain and what are the current risk events that are going on currently in the environment. So, of course, you know who I am now. And then so let's discuss the definitions of SCRIM, right, or supply chain risk management. And basically, this is just the foundation of where we like to start at in the class, because different organizations, different agencies, different part of the government, you're going to see a different definition according to how their supply chain kind of interacts. And so what we want to do is kind of paint that picture for you to say, okay, here's, the generic, the kind of the meats of the potatoes of what DoD describes as SCRIM. And then we'll get into what the public sector looks at SCRIM as, and then we'll look at what the Air Force or SAF-AQ, how we kind of help them define SCRIM in a more detailed sense. So when you're looking at this, I mean, basically the idea and the overview of SCRIM, while you're looking at this definition, is to capture your vulnerabilities. Where are you vulnerable at in your organization when it comes to your supply chain? Where do you enter your supply chain at? And how can we connect these vulnerabilities to the actual supplier base? So you understand what percentage of your supplier base is going to cause you or have the likelihood of a supply chain attack happening or an event happening. It doesn't necessarily have to be adversarial. All right. So when you look at this definition, one of the key things to take away is that, there's a broad brushstroke of vulnerabilities that can take place, whether it's from cyber side, whether it's from national, policies and regulations, or is it just environmental and, things that you can't control. We want to make sure that we're able to mitigate those threats and those vulnerabilities. But first, we have to know how to identify them. When we transfer from a DoD perspective, let's go to the private sector, where it's more about the continuity of the business, right? So they may not be looking at threats from adversarial aspect like we are, right? But they should, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. But more of their strategy is built on how do we make the day-to-day operation successful, and that is a different tone, because from the DoD or the government side of the house, we rely heavily on acquisitions that happen from the commercial side of the platform. So how do we bridge this gap? How do we look at what we consider as SCRIM and how the private sector considers SCRIM, and how do we merge it together so that we're not looking at the environment that we're sitting in right now? And that's going to be key, because like I said, your prime contractors and the ones who are doing the acquisitions, they're not really looking down on supply chain the same way we are. And so that conversation needs to have, and it's going to start with the education piece. So now let's transfer this from how the Air Force or SAF-AQ and us help design this definition. And this is a very, detailed definition of what SCRIM is. But the key thing to take away is from the very beginning that this is a systematic process. So there is actual steps that need to take place into actually monitoring your supply chain, connecting vulnerabilities to your supplier base, mitigating strategies, and looking for specific risk lenses that's going to help you do all of these things so that you're better protected. So I'll give you a little bit of time to kind of digest this, and then we'll move on. All right. We won't go into why SCRIM is important. So let's look at the evolution of SCRIM, right? And for time's sake, we won't go into why SCRIM is important. I think we all know. But let's look at this evolution of supply chain risk management. And we've seen that, early on, supply chain has always been a center focus of any conflict. but it's changed now, and that battlefield is not so much boots on the ground, where it's more digital, it's more intellectual property, and it's more connected to the global environment. So how do we defend that? How do we look at it? Well, we have to understand the process of how we got here. We have to continue to look at these lessons learned and realize that we're still playing in the same environment. It's becoming more sophisticated, absolutely, but we understand who the players are now. We understand how they recon, how they position themselves to interrupt our supply chain, and now we got to understand how to put a defense together with it. Which we talk about scrim teams in the class and enterprise approach, but it's good to understand the level that we're at and where we've come from and where the potential attacks are going to happen next. Not only attacks, like I said before, but where are we also placing undue harm on our own supply chain by being complacent or being vulnerable in areas that we understand that we can strengthen or have the ability and resources to strengthen, but just won't do it. So as you look at this evolution, we all know about solar winds, but solar winds led to Colonial Pipelines, led to the New York subway stations, led to other areas within supply chain that we should have caught. Solar wind should have been that light bulb that changed the whole national supply chain and every industry in it to say we can't get compromised, but we still see ourselves becoming compromised on a daily basis. And we just had the first publicly known ransomware paid by the U.S. government. And so, now we see what happens with the executive orders coming out where we want to say, okay, we really need to take a hold of this. But we've had the information and we've known that this is possible, but now we're just now starting to really act on it. So again, continue on looking at the evolution, we see that cyber attacks are continuing to happen and becoming more sophisticated, right? And this is just a timeline just to show where we were again, and to look at the cyber impact all the way up until now, and how it's going to actually continue. We don't see it easing up, and we see the great constraints on our supply chain now. This is only going to breed opportunities for adversaries. It's not only in cybersecurity attacks, but in counterfeit parts. We're going to look at transportation failures. We're going to see shortages within our supply chain. You have to be aware of those and be able to position yourself to withstand it. Just in time was a great idea. Lean manufacturing and lean supply chain was a great idea until cyber attacks started happening. And once disruption happens, then those things are no longer valuable. So looking at sustainability, once like we did, a few decades ago, might be an option that we want to look at and helping us secure our supply chain and move forward. So, and John, do you want to speak to this anymore, or?
The one thing that we have to also take into consideration here, and James did a pretty good job of covering, is also we're looking at the intellectual property aspects of this as well. And when we talk about that, dealing with what you're dealing with in sustainment, we have to have an understanding as well. If you look, you see a Jeep or basically a Hummer type of format, right? In one of the pictures as you go down. Well, that particular Hummer, imagine the design that the Army had, or the technology advantage that we had with strategy, with a system, mainly a machine, a weapon system, being able to go at almost a 90-degree angle as it's climbing. That gave us a weapons advantage, gave us an Army advantage, gave us a maneuver advantage. We lost that advantage because for a short time frame, they were buying GM's backed information or stealing it out of General Motors. Now, not only did that technology go away, but we lost that technological weapon advantage as well. So that's one of the things that I want to bring out here. In the end, the Russian hackers, I want to give you another example to bring this out. And we'll talk about this, but the foreign cyber attack that you see in Illinois water supply in 2011, we had the same kind of attack that, and I mentioned that when I'm really doing the full briefing this year in Florida. Why? That's a learning curve and processes and things that you put in place that also deal with the supply chain. Was that information already corrupted, or was that CPS already corrupted when it was started? Or is this just a lack of education and knowledge? Thanks, James.
No problem. All right. Any questions so far? All right, we'll keep rolling. And so we see continuous attacks that keep rising within Scrim, even with our partner nations. And so it's not just limited to the U.S. What we do know is that our adversaries, the Russias, the Chinas, the Pakistans, they will disrupt their own supply chain to impact us if we know we have a dependency on it. So that's why we see stuff like the new FAR coming out that's going to require more of our supply chain to be American-based, so that our dependency is within house instead of globally. But you know, we still want to have that impact there on us and have to monitor it. And so when we're looking at the executive orders, here are just 2 executive orders that come out that we really need to pay attention to. And one is on the national cybersecurity piece, and then one is on the American supply chain. And how do we, address these and kind of bring it home so that we're within regulations, but also making sure that we're applying the correct practices to protect our supply chain. So we won't go into those. We will address kind of like how we plan to address the presidential orders and how are we going to solve the cyber activity that's going on. And it's basically going to be based in 4 different areas that we've designed, and it's going to be all centered around the operation of Scrim. Right now, we don't have a really dedicated CMF or MOS if you're Army to kind of just sit back and look at this on a day-to-day basis. So at the current state, this is still an additional duty that's applied into some of the critical areas in logistics and supply chain, but the operation still needs to be addressed, and you have to learn how to design the operation. What are you going to do to implement the Scrim program? You have to access you have to do supply chain risk assessments so that you can monitor your supply chain. Once you monitor the supply chain, that service has to be able to look at every milestone and be able to give a dedicated health score on what your supply chain is. And then who's going to manage it? We have to put people in place that are going to be able to understand what the risk is, be able to deliver the recommendation on that risk to the stakeholders, and so that the stakeholder can make a decision about the health of the supplier base, whether we need to terminate it or whether we need to treat it. And we go into 4 ways you can treat risk, but those things have to take place. And when you have those things in place, what you realize is that you can capture your vulnerabilities and set mitigation plans well ahead of an event happening. Hopefully the event never happens, but you're ready. You have that plan in place. You're ready to deploy mitigation strategies, and you're ready to assist in other organizations who may be facing the likelihood of an event happening. Then you want to look into the life cycle of the vendor assessment. Yeah, you got a question there?
Yeah, no, to add in what was going on there, James. James mentioned MOS. He's actually talking about like an AFSC for those that are in the logistical piece that would take care of that throughout the life cycle of the weapon system. And another thing that he's bringing out here is that even though you might have a security officer or different people that play a role, whether it's in the R&D side, through the building and management of the systems engineering process, or even at the tail end, that work security, that's usually an additional duty. And that additional duty is usually falls within the scope of the program protection plan or adding on some security. What James is bringing out is in this piece, when you design, access, monitor, and manage, there should be somebody looking at this process iteratively all the way through the total life cycle. And so that's one of the things that we're promoting here is that Scrim as a service needs to happen within the particular units, but there are also particular pieces and parts within the operational design, whether it's at the system level for the build or whether it is at the different component levels. And this process takes place at both levels to add the kind of security that you need. Thanks, James.
No problem. And so when you're looking at the life cycle and the vendor assessment, what you're really doing here is, grading your supplier base, and you want to make sure that throughout the life cycle or however long the program lasts, that the supplier base is meeting the needs of your Scrim program. And this can be simple. You can start this simply by just requesting RFI information about what the vendor's supply chain risk management program looks like. And when you do that, you get an idea of where your supplier base is, because you'll get a range of supply chain risk assessments information back to you that has no synergy to it, and that can cause a problem, because 4 or 5 primes looking at it differently will render you different results within your supply chain, and it's kind of hard to mitigate that strategy. So before the life cycle even starts, or the program even starts, we always suggest you develop a vendor education program that lets them know that this is what we expect, these are the rules and regulations that we go by, and this is how we want our supply chain to be protected. That way, everybody starts off the program with this slate saying that, okay, we understand what the customer wants, and this is what the things that we need to do to protect our supply chain. I know it's easier said than done, but we have seen great results in even the smallest onset of this being developed. And then lastly, you want to manage things like SBOMs, software bill of materials, the supplier lifecycle, and alerts. You want to be able to have a way to manage alerts that come in. Of course, this is going to require some type of tool, whether it's internal or external, to kind of capture this, and some type of team to be able to relay all the alerts. But we want to kind of have a way to manage all of that stuff so that we're on top of it. I teach early on, and I passed a slide that 90% of all vulnerabilities in attacks and alerts that come to the DoD or the government agency is known by senior staff. So that's telling me that we know that we're vulnerable, but we just don't know what to do or how to protect it. And that's why it's important to kind of have these teams monitoring these aspects. When it comes to the presidential order, we have to understand that organizations are not quite set up to do this. We see the environment and the organizations moving in the right direction. But again, do we understand how the teams need to be set up? What's the culture need to be? When we get into the framework here in a minute, we'll look at some of that risk-based methodology and kind of how you need to bring it into the acquisition fold when you're looking at Scrim to better set yourself up for success during your programs. But we still face challenges. We have lack of visibility across the life cycle, across the supply chain, including SBOMs for those who have heavy software and network needs. The communication and shared knowledge is just not there. So when you look at the presidential second executive order, especially on cybersecurity, I believe, when you look at section 2, it's telling you find a way to break down the barriers of communication, of communicating these risks that are associated with supply chain, because we see a lot of bleed over. We see a lot of vendors that are working on multiple projects, and we have to be able to share risks that are happening, or the potential of one of the vulnerabilities being likelihood with our brothers and sister organizations, so that they can have mitigation plans in place as well. So when you're looking at an executive order, we want to pull that out and figure that out and talk collaboratively with each other so that we're better protected. Any questions so far? All right, that's current events. All right, so we keep on. So let's get into the framework, all right? And we'll kind of wrap up day 1 here with this, because I know we're right at 9:30. So when we're looking at the framework, what's critical is that we change our acquisition from more of a technical operation to a strategic risk-based procurement force. And that's just simple. It doesn't take much to do, right? But we want to change the culture and the mindset of the acquisition. The acquisition is where Scrim starts at, where you enter the supply chain at. You get your requirements. They should be at the table when the requirements are being built for the program. This is what we need. And they should, when they go to source, they should be able to have these steps in place or these methodologies in place. And this is supported by ISO 31000 and other risk-based frameworks. But you want to have a risk-based thinking process. When you select a supplier, what risks can they pose to these vulnerabilities? And again, this is where education becomes really important, because everybody should know within the supply chain where the vulnerabilities are. So when you're selecting your suppliers and you say, okay, well, we have a serious network vulnerability, we need to be thinking that, is this supplier going to do us more harm, or is this supplier someone that can strengthen? What is it going to be, and be able to understand it before onboarding them. And then you want to have problem solving in place. What is your risk-based problem solving method going to be when you're alerted of a potential risk? It should be ready to go. And then the decision-making process should be at hand. Hey, we have this problem, which we know what to do. Here are mitigation strategies, and it should be readily available to go to the decision makers to make a quick decision and change the course of action. We'll look at, if we have time at the end, we'll show you some case studies on how NASA kind of put some of these practices in place and how they've seen success, and also have seen failures as well. And this is a good example of being proactive within the supply chain risk management profile that will get you there. Right now, we're looking at supply chain risk costing near $1 trillion to the national supply chain. And that's just going to continue to grow as we look at more ransomware is happening, more counterfeit parts happening. We know rare minerals are, they're being, confiscated at a really, really high rate. So we're getting a lot of counterfeit parts within our supply chain because the rare materials, cost of goods and services are going up. All of these things are playing a major factor. So when we look at rapid acquisition and trying to get everything into ways we've been doing it for the past decade, we really got to pull that onion back and say, okay, is this doing us more harm than it is good? And we really have to change that focus. It's good to have it in place, but just have the risk-based thinking process in place while you're doing it, and we'll see levels of success. So when we're looking at the acquisition phase in this framework, we want to make sure that we identify the threats. And how do we do that, right? So here's just some simple things that you can do to look at a vendor to tell, right? And of course, when we look at risk lenses, we'll dig really deep into it. But you can do things like look at the business credit score and rating profiles. And this is done sometimes, right? This is done, a lot of times across the board. But looking at the corporate family tree and who's involved with this business, who are the stakeholders, who are the parent company? Is that parent-child relationship going to be detrimental to your supply chain? If so, are you willing to take on that risk? Are you willing to tolerate that risk? We always teach a zero trust approach. So if we see that there's, personnel, the corporate tree has any of our adversaries on there, the Chinas, the Russians, then, of course, we're going to recommend that you don't use that vendor. It's just not a good practice. But you need to understand the corporate family tree. And then at the end, you want to be able to illuminate the supply chain. And this goes beyond tier 1. You want to go down to tier 2, tier 3, to the 9th tier to understand who is in your supply chain, to better understand where potential attack can happen at. And, again, when we look at some case studies, we'll see that mom and pop shops cause disruptions just as well as billion-dollar companies cause disruptions. It's just who's paying attention to the supply chain and who's going to impact that vulnerability.
James, since we're short on time, I think this is a good piece to talk about one of the things that we've seen as well. One of the use cases is, of course, Lexmark. And any of you might say, well, what do you mean by Lexmark? Lexmark is a US-based company, right? Well, yes, it is, but who owns it now? It is owned by a company out of China or a Chinese company. This I found out, and I'm giving you a use case that many of us can be sensors, and this is the reason why we talk about illuminating the supply chain and understanding from a corporate point of view what businesses own or who owns them, and look at that ownership piece. Lexmark, US-based company. I had my wife's friend works at the company. We talked to her. She informed my wife just about 3 years ago that, oh yeah, we're going through a lot of changes and things are going on because the company's been bought out by China. My wife just happened to mention to me, said, oh, this is what's going on with her. It triggered something with me because of the understanding of that Lexmark not only proliferated AFIT, but most of AFMC was under the contract of Lexmark. This I knew because I was having some discussions with the communication squadron about Lexmark, and sometimes the system not being available early in the morning. They say, yes, they do downloads. That went from triggered my point of downloading information which is unclassified. There is an exchange. That information is taking any unclassified thing that's been photographed on it, and if it's not sending it back, it has the capability of that information being grabbed. When you look at AFMC being a major weapon system, or AFMC headquarters and what it is, now you look at all the different centers that are on there, that aggregation of data, what could the art of the possible be? I raised that question up to my department head as well as to the communicators. It went away. When I say it went away, the information I gave went away, but later on it was documented that those downloads would decrease, stop happening, And it also went away that there was an issue there that we now look at that contract piece. So there was a question that popped up, James.
What was it? Do you see it?
I'm looking, somebody's hand went up, I believe, or I saw something triggered. So it's something that we could talk about, but that particular aspect is letting you know that everybody can act as a particular sensor. And that was one of the things that we want to bring up. But if you have scrim in place that are checking those different things, sometimes that kind of thing would be a trigger, whether that's written in your contracts or whether that is something that is monitored by somebody or a tool that's acting for you as scrim as a service. I just want to make sure we go through that use case. Any questions? All right, I saw something, but James, turn it back over to you.
All right, I think somebody's joining the chat.
Okay.
Joining the group, I mean. All right, so I mean, good point with Lexmarks, right? In identifying those potential vulnerabilities, which ended up being a great compromise for us. So, but when you're recognizing the threats, right, we'll continue on with this. Is that you want to look at a company and see if they've had supplier failures before. Have they gone bankrupt? Have they had situations where they couldn't produce inventory levels? Look at the history of your vendors. Take the time to do it. You don't want to onboard somebody who has a constant supplier failure. What does the supply chain interruption look like? If there is one, how can they maintain it? Is there capabilities to still deliver during certain, natural disasters or public strikes? Any of that, can they maintain continuity with the program? If not, then you might want to look at a different vendor who has more of a mature model and can kind of filter through some of the noise in the supply chain. Another big one's compliance and regulatory violations, and this is really growing right now within the supply chain environment, especially everything going on with COVID and the constraints in our supply chain right now. We're seeing a lot of shortcuts happening. Even as I'm working at GDIT, I'm constantly monitoring the regulatory compliance, making sure no legal things are happening. We're seeing a lot of labor laws being broken, and so we're addressing it because it leads to the next one. We don't want our reputation to be dinged because there's bad labor practices with one of our supplier bases, or human trafficking is happening with one of our supplier bases, or price cuts and price gouging is happening within our supply chain. That's going to impact us greatly, and even though it may not be something that we control or we can contribute to, once the news is out, the news is out, and it's hard to bring back, almost impossible to make a 360 on that image damage. And so we want to make sure that at all costs that we protect our reputation, even though it's not 100% foolproof, but we don't want to go down that rabbit hole of having a great percentage of our supplier base acting unethical or breaking regulatory compliance standards. So next thing you do is continuous monitor, and this is where we're failing at right now. We just don't have the bandwidth. We don't have the personnel to do it. So either we do it externally, hire it externally, or we create the bandwidth and the personnel to do it. But this has to be done. We have to look at our supply chain just beyond the initial onset of the program. We have milestones for everything else. We check milestones, maintenance milestones, and throughout the program lifecycle, but we're not including supply chain risk. And this is where we're seeing the most of it happen. And really, when we look at adversarial threats or just threats in general or vulnerabilities, we're seeing them happen either in the very beginning of the supply chain or right after the middle milestone where we catch it and it's almost accidental that it's caught. Just because somebody just realizes something just doesn't look right, or we keep testing something, and then we finally said, okay, we need to look at what's going on while we keep getting, bad material. And so we need to make sure that we understand how to do the assessment process properly and continue to do it. And part of the assessment process is looking at, the business and the industry and how it's changing and how that changes in those materials and those technologies, how this is going to impact our supply chain. Because we can't look at it from the onset and say, okay, this is going to be the same way next year. Businesses change, and when those changes will impact your supply chain or your supplier base. So we want to make sure that as we continuously monitor those changes, that we're aware that these are potentials from the very beginning, and how we plan to mitigate that disruption so we can continue to have success. So when we're looking at the lifecycle management and supply chain risk, here are 6 critical things that I really want you to do, right? And that's really getting a grasp on your products and services that are in your supply chain. You want to make sure that you have a supplier vendor management program, and that's just consistent of education and that you're monitoring your suppliers. But another great thing about this management program is the communication aspect has to be there. We no longer can bring them on board and not really have this detailed conversation with them. We need to make sure that if we catch something, our vendors may not have the resources that we have to kind of illuminate the supply chain. So, they may not be bad actors. They may not just have the ability to track it down. And so we can give them that information saying, hey, we're here to work with you, but this is what we see, and so that they can make changes as well. We don't want them to get impacted. So if they get impacted, that means it's a disruption to us, and it costs us more time and resources. Understanding and grasping software bill of materials, especially for your networks. This is really critical. I think the FAR that's coming out in March or April timeframe is really addressing that this might be a mandate for us to do. So we really want to make sure that we kind of grasp this and say, we understand our software, the coding on it, the open source has been evaluated and is ready to go. We don't see any potential harm that's going to be entering our networks. And if we do, then we got to make sure that we're prepared to address it. Emerging technologies, what's the blockchain, 3D printing, AI technology that's in everything now, crypto, all of this stuff that's going to impact our supply chain. Doing research, just a few months ago, we found out that supply chain is the one industry that has more emerging technologies than any other industry. And that's almost, it's an amazing time to be a part of supply chain. But as a risk person or looking at it from procurement or program manager, it's just more you have to worry about, more you have to look into, and what the impacts are going to be. And as we get more technology, that means things are becoming more sophisticated. That means that the human capital that we deploy to handle our supply chain has to be aware of these changes and be able to understand them and how to work around them. Next is cyber awareness. As John alluded to, this is a challenge, through and through, but we have to partner with cyber and all these cross-functional sections of physical security and engineering to make sure that we're together and we're synergized on supply chain risk management, and that we're not just, this is the cyber lane. This is a team effort. We talk about cross-functional teams. We put everybody together from acquisition to physical security to warehousing, transportation to cyber, and we all sit at the table and we talk about it. Because hey, I want the lowest person to understand that hey, if a new driver comes up to the facility, he's dropping a package off that's not due until 2 days from now. Okay, that's a red flag. If I got China writing on my packaging, then that's a red flag, and they need to know it. So, I think you got a question, John?
Yeah. One of the things, there's different layers to this as well.
Mm-hmm.
So some of the things, like when the package shows up, that's a physical aspect, that's a tracking aspect that deals with the supply chain risk management for the transportation, the bodies that touch it, the humans in the loop. But when you look at those tiers that James is also giving, the SBOM, which would also include the HBOM or firmware or the CPS, emerging technology, cyber awareness, and criticality assessments, there's different sensor layers in those emergent technologies. There's roles to play for chief scientists and the R&D community. There's roles to play within AFRL, let's say. There's also roles to play within the centers, AFLC, test center, sustainment centers. There's roles to also play. We got people on here from the SWAG, right? There's roles for them to play in that assessment process and being able to go boots on the ground and talk to people, but also to spread that knowledge in them and understanding. There's roles to play with the depot. There's another section that we're covering, because what do the depots do? They pull things off the shelf. They act as sensors when you're going through a wing cycle for a maintenance, an upgrade, or if an incident happens on the line, let's say where LRU or SRU is failing at a higher rate, after you've done a maintenance push or after you've done an upgrade push, that depot maintenance guy or gal, or those that are working in the loggies and pulling that stuff out of DLA or off and reporting it through DSMS, there are first sensors that are out there saying, hey, this C5 Galaxy we had them up and operating, but after we did this upgrade push in this SRU, it is dropping and failing. What is the issue? That should get reported within the intelligence community so that those threat assessments can be done. There are a lot of different ranges, a lot of different things that play a part, but within this life cycle, it all involves from cradle to grave, as James and I keep pointing out. I just wanted to jump in on that piece, James. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. And some good points. Any questions so far? I know we're on top of the hour, so I'm kind of keep pushing, but if there's a question, just please feel free. All right. So at the end of the framework, you have Scrum tools. There's a bunch of them out there, but internally, you also need to look within yourself and how you do it. But you're going to need some support in this area. There's just too many suppliers out there to manage this on the onset, and so you need to look at a tool that can give you the risk lenses, that can look at potential threats and kind of give you that data that you need to comb through, and making sure that the data is credible and is relevant to your supplier base. Everybody's supply chain, everybody's mission and program is going to be different, but we need to make sure that we see the data that's going to support what we're doing so that we can make timely decisions. And then it has to support your Scrum posture. All right, so there's internal, approved product list, the DLA, the GSA Get To program that's sponsored by the Air Force. I mean, you have tools out there, and also internal support is out there as well. But you're going to need some type of support and help in tackling the Scrum. We have, a bunch of tools at GDIT that we use. Of course, it's commercially, even John used our own tools. But you need something to support you, because one supplier can illuminate hundreds of other suppliers, which then can illuminate, so many others. And you really need to start capturing that second and third tier supply chain so that you can be effective. Okay, so that's the framework piece. I'm kind of gonna jump to day 2, and then we won't go over this. We had the 27th Intel come in and kind of do a brief about acquisition intelligence during the class, and so let's get through these slides real quick.
The one thing to bring out is that there's going to be a give and take with the intelligence community based off of things that you find out, and they also can be responsive to different questions that might come up while James is finding that. However, what we have to do is as well, when you get into some of the pieces that's going to deal with the building blocks, that you're going to deal with the technical review levels, and then that transition from the technical review levels into how that weapon system operates, you're going to have that under consideration. Remember, there's new guidance and policies that have been dropped. 5000.83 is going to have some mandates for some of you who are involved maybe in this call, but there's also going to be things that's going to work, because now you got to look at the cybersecurity challenges that you're going to have within the maintenance review levels. How are they adding that particular pieces in as you understand the technology, and as you add maintenance in, as you're going through the systems engineering process? Those maintenance should include supply chain reviews. Supply chain reviews based on the SBOM, HBOM, and firmware that you have going in. That's the reason why James mentioned that. James, back to you.
All right. So I know we're on top of the hour, JD. Anybody need a break, or we're gonna keep pushing?
I would say we keep pushing, and then once you get done, we have time. We'll go into Q&A.
Okay, sounds good. All right. So at the foundation of Scrum is the assessment process. All right, and really what we're looking at is what's critical to the organization. So since we don't have a great bandwidth and we don't have a lot of personnel to do this, we're not sitting nice like NASA with 130 people. We want to look at this, our critical or strategic suppliers and products and services. And that way, we're coming down to what's going to be the showstopper in the program. So at least we can look at the critical items and say, okay, we got our eyes on this. Then we want to look at the vulnerability assessment. We want to match these critical items and say, are any of them associated with some vulnerabilities that we have within our program? If they are, then we create a threat assessment. What's the potential likelihood? How do we respond? And then we need to share that knowledge. So the assessment process, it really is broken down into these steps. What you want to do is have an orientation process with your vendors and your supplier base. So when you bring on board somebody, you want to say, hey guys, we're doing this assessment process. We look at our supplier base. For me, I do it every 90 days, but it's up to you and your programs offices, how you want to conduct it. And then give them education on, again, rules, policies, whatever. Then you want to target and start planning, right? You want to look at the organization. You want to look at the risk lenses. What are they? Counterfeit, financial, distressed suppliers, data breaches, whatever your risk lenses are going to be, according to your supplier base and supply chain, you want to make those up in the forefront, right? And so, for instance, I'm always looking at cybersecurity and open source at GDIT. I'm looking at the financial records with my supplier base at GDIT. I'm looking at human capital. What's the foreign influence? I'm looking at environmental impact. Where's my supply base located? What percentage of my supplier base is in a hostile area, meaning is subject to, hurricanes or, tornadoes or anything like that happens yearly. I look at those informations and what emerging technologies are out there. So I say the risk lenses, these are just the key topics that you're going to identify in your program with your teams to say, hey, this is what's critical to us. And then illumination. You want to start illuminating the supply chain. Either you use a tool to do it, or you can do it the old-fashioned way when we did supply chain insurance and just asking each supplier to identify who their tier 1 supplier is, and then you kind of build it on your own. But you want to dribble it down to go down there. So you don't want to just look at your tier 1 supplier and say everything's okay. Counterfeit parts don't happen to tier 1. Disruption doesn't happen at tier 1, even though it can. It's always going. It's 90% of the time it's going to happen beyond that visibility wall at the tier 2 level. How are we going to triage it? How are we going to address risk? Right? Are we going to transfer it? Are we going to treat it? Are we going to terminate it? Or are we going to tolerate it? Right? For the 4 ways to triage our risk. And so, what are those mitigation strategies going to look like? Are we going to pour resources into a vendor to help them kind of prop up, kind of gain some loyalty, but also have the ability to influence what their supplier does for our benefit? So things to look at. Once you mitigate, then you want to monitor and support. Continuous monitoring in your supply chain, it can never stop now, because we know that the adversary, we know that natural disasters, we know that the way the global environment is right now, we don't have the ability to sit back and not look at our supply chain. So here's a step process that I developed to actually take on the supply chain, and then we'll stop here at day 2 and kind of turn it over to cyber for John. But when we're looking at the supply chain risk assessment process, this is the flow chart that I developed. And by me doing this, I was able to, combat, over 40,000 risk alerts just at GDIT alone. And so this process works, but you can plug and play in it, right? I've changed stuff in it sometimes, but we've known that this is helps us identify us early. And so when we start with the criticality assessment, again, who are your strategic or critical suppliers? And what I mean by that is, if you have a product or service that is sensitive, or it can, if it's deployed in a weapon system, and it's counterfeit, that it can show stop, then you want to address that. If you have a vendor that you're spending a lot of capital with, then you want to make sure that you're tracking them. If you got a critical vendor that's uploading software or code into your organization, then you want to make sure that you're monitoring them. Then you want to do a business market research, and that's, again, you want to know if there's shortages in the industry. We've got chip shortages right now, semiconductors. What part of your supplier base is impacted by that? What's the workaround going to be? That line of communication should be open. We have Dell, where I have weekly conversations with them to understand where can I find systems in place to report what's going to be a life cycle detriment to us, right? Then I want to go and evaluate what's emerging in the markets. So I want to understand what products and suppliers are coming, what's going to be the disruption. This is one of the biggest ones that people often overlook, is that there's products and stuff coming in there that's going to disrupt the market. And we have a supplier base that is not paying attention to it. And next thing you know, we're a legacy customer, or this disruption is impacting us in some way. So you just want to be aware of it, right? And talk to your supplier base about it. Then you want to eliminate the supply chain for any risky suppliers. If there is risky suppliers in there, we triage it. What's problematic in supply chain? Any of these problems going to be associated with our vulnerabilities? If so, we conduct the threat assessment. We compare and assess threat against the vulnerabilities. What's the likelihood of it's going to happen? What percentage of supplier base is going to be responsible for it? And then we want to inform the stakeholders. After we have this finding, then we want to continue doing further review. We want to select the appropriate countermeasures. So when we mitigating this, we want to make sure that countermeasures are in place that are going to help benefit our supply chain. And then we want to deploy the tools that we have to continuously monitor it. So we look at these tools and capabilities to kind of keep tracking threats, keep tracking vulnerabilities. We want to document the findings in the assessment. We want to implement new strategies as each milestone comes out. Hey, we strengthen vulnerabilities in this area, but we see that we're getting weaker in this area. We want to make sure we document it and be able to put strategies in place to strengthen the total supplier base. And then what was effective in the SCRIM strategy, document and share the results. So 15-step process of what I do every 90 days for the supply chain risk assessment process, and it works wonders. So this is a little bit of work. This is a little bit of, takes a little bit of bandwidth to do, but without teams being in place to do it, it can be cumbersome. But at least these are some steps I'm giving you where you can actually start deploying into your supplier base, into your program offices, and say, hey guys, at least we need to look at our suppliers every so often if you don't got the bandwidth to do it now. So, any questions so far? Okay, so
I know we're moving here, so no question is a bad question, ladies and gentlemen. And also, I don't want to start calling y'all QC quiet class. So JD didn't heard me say that before. So while James is skipping forward, James, you want to hit this? I think though.
Yeah.
This before you move on. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I'm gonna hit this real quick. So discussing with FAQ over the last year, some change. This is what they look at as risk lenses. So this is what FAQ is saying they're looking at for their supplier base and supply chain. Product and quality is any counterfeit parts. Again, this falls into the supply chain insurance process, right? The financials, self-explanatory, political or regulatory. We want to make sure that those things are in compliance. What's the operation, right? What is the operation of the supplier doing? What are they doing for you? Are they capable of doing the operation? As we look at some case studies in NASA, we found out that, sometimes it's this mom and pop shop that had a really good write-up. We want to make sure we put boots on the ground, as we say in the Army, and look at some of these OEMs, look at some of these vendors to say, okay, all right, they up and up, they got the operation together. Environmental, technology, again, human capital and foreign influence. So in human capital is going to be one of those things where you're looking at the skill level of your workforce and the trust level of your workforce to make sure, one, if you do have foreign nationals in your trust force, that it's not going to impact you in a negative light, and that you have the capabilities and the personnel that can handle the mission and offset. So this is what the risk lenses looks like from a SAFAQ level. And so their supplier base and supply chains are subject to these things at their level. But I want to also, all right, so yeah, let's keep talking quick about SAFAQ. So when you look at the supply chain risk management process from SAFAQ and these risk lenses, you see that they come down into two different sections, right? What's functional and what's in the communities, right? And so the functional aspects, what we talked about, right? Acquisition being the start, cyber, and intelligence, right? And so again, we bring all these people together to kind of build this team to make the synergy happen so that we have, credible data to make decisions off of. That's why we have intelligence brief on the first day, and then the 309 software engineer group brief on the last day, so you kind of get the whole package. But when you're looking at acquisition and cyber and intelligence, those are functional areas that we have to deploy. But the communities that everything falls into is going to be security, logistics, and the industrial base. Industrial base being really important, right? Because they're a part of the team. You got to have, the primes sitting at the table, just like you have acquisition sitting at the table, and so everybody understands and talks together, right? And then OB1 from SAFAQ is good, right? So we're looking at the critical areas, we're looking at the risk lenses, right? The supply chain risk, and we're looking at the operation that's happening in a whole. So you have readiness, you have response, you have recovery, right? But what's missing here is the fact that there's no triage and there's no mitigation, right? So you have to be able to triage your supply chain events. You have to put those steps in place so you understand what you're going to do. Back to that risk-based methodology, right? Decision-making process. Here's the problem-solving tools, and then we're good. We're off to running, right? What I will say is this: nobody's going to be 100% protecting their supply chain. Nobody's going to be, supply chain risk-free, unfortunately. But we can limit the impact of every risk if we have those mitigation and triage in place. So we're gonna feel the burn a little bit sometimes, but we can at least limit how much of the burn we do feel.
And part of that is going to be, as James continues to move, the defense in depth construct. One of the things that we talk about is, and you've heard me say it, everybody's a sensor. Well, we'll go through some of those different aspects, but what you're doing is going through a sifting mechanism. And like James said, there needs to be mitigation, and part of mitigation is lessons learned. You can't get that without the grassroots level. You can't get that without the loggies. You can't get that without the maintenance, and they got to buy in as well. And so that's part of the discussion and part of the things that we point out as we're going through. And as when you're looking at Scrum as a service, everybody's got to develop how they're a part of that team and working it. You can put everything in place, but if the contractor, if the people who manages your contracts never write in the new capability that there's some accountability to the primes, now you're going to be triaging just to get your information in so they'll give you the data that you need to make decisions. No, the contracting and the PM guys have to be involved up front when they're initially writing the contracts to say, hey, we push this responsibility and accountability down from the primes to the second and third tier in the initial part, so that you can get the data that you need. Thanks, Jay.
Okay, so to close the section out, what are some additional risk lenses that I would like for you to look at? What's currently in the market right now that I want you to kind of put in the back of your mind, or not even the back of your mind, I want it in the forefront, right? Because this is what we're seeing. This is what the research is showing. This is what I'm going through every day at GDIT. What we're going through every day with DIP chain. And so these additional risk lenses is what you need to put in your map. Your legal and compliance, diversity. And what I mean by diversity is diversity in your supply chain. If you are sole sourcing, that's fine. It happens. Where can we put resources at to gather, more diverse supply chain in that area? Can we make it happen? Look into it. This is going to be one of the biggest problems in the next year is diversity in the supply chain. Debarments, corruption, bribery, and fraud. All these things I talked about earlier, the ethics of your supplier base. These are the things that are resonating right now in the global market. Source code. Anybody can contribute to open source. Is it safe? Tech, software, bill of materials. The war right now on conflict minerals, data sources, and data storage. One thing you really want to look at is, and this is not asked often, and when I do my research, it's alarming to me. But if you got a vendor that's coming on board and is providing some type of service or software materials, you need to know where the servers are located at. A lot of these companies develop source code and stuff from India and offshore markets because it's cheaper, and that's where the level of expertise is at. I skipped over the slide, but the reason why we do Scrum is one of the red things I highlight is that America right now is 2 to 3 generations behind in technology. All of that's been offshore. So you need to understand if your materials or your information from these vendors is actually stored offshore. That's the question that you have to ask. It's a mandatory question I do at GDIT, because if it is, then that's a great vulnerability to us.
Absolutely. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Jay.
No, so I'm in here for day 2.
So you're going to the slides. Great. It allows me to build up. So when you take a look at that, think about what we're doing now. One of the things that I did mention, I was a program element monitor when I was on air staff, right? I did that for a total of 2 years. Unlike most PMs only spend 1, I ended up spending 2 because I was dealing with crypto modernization at the time. That's when we were doing the consolidation and went to the triage of handling nuclear command and control, as well as some of the impacts of cyber. I took the near less than an ACAT 3, less than 500 million to an ACAT 1 program that was estimated at 2.5 billion when I left. That's the reason why I ended up spending 2 years. But the reason why I mentioned it, crypto monetization plays a role. During that time frame, we look now, you know, we're doing a 180 back from where we weren't there. We got away from foundries. We got away from our own development pieces. Why? Because we were looking to save money. But now that has become a center of gravity for us. Chipsets, different designs, the counterfeiting process. So now what are we doing? We're about to invest back in foundries. What we need to do now is take a look as we move forward with that combined effort of where we're going to play those most critical parts. All right, that allows me to roll straight into it. Well, first, any questions before I roll through Cyber Scrim? I'm going to try to give you some of the key parts. So, and it's going to kind of move fast, but hopefully, if you guys have some questions or things, please inject. Okay. So usually this is what we end up showing. Go to the next slide, James. So as we're rolling through it, the different learning objectives that you see here, one of the things to identify is an attack surface, and then warfare versus crime. In the end, the information technology that you're dealing with is going to be a key aspect. But the proposed approach in cybersecurity, I'm going to give you some definitions to take a look at and read those definitions. This is where the private sector is going, but also where we're guiding some of the aspects of what to look at within the Air Force construct. Next slide. So one of the essential things is for you to understand, C-Scrim. So the important piece of this is an upcoming international standard. It's still draft. This is me working on a G32, but having some impact to this. A form of this definition will come out as a major impact, private as an international community from all over. You Rolls-Royce, GM, Ford, Boeing. You know, that's the reason why I spoke at the Boeing conference this year. You got to look at where we're going with C-Scrim and how it's going to affect the life cycle. Next slide. So the importance of understanding that is, how do you do this distribution of targets? So when you're taking a look at the distribution of targets, you have to understand that the individual plays a role as a launching point. Why do I mention an individual? Because you go all the way down to OEMs. Some of them are mom and pop shops. However, there's also connection points that these systems do with these mom and pop shops, which also then becomes targets where information can lodge or be housed. Also, some of these mom and pop shops, when they're doing their tooling is based off the aspect of them using their own computers. You can throw that off by a millimeter. Now you have an impact to the supply chain if they're tooling for a major customer that also feeds that supply chain for that weapons system. Next slide. James got me playing. Okay, so when you take a look at this particular cybersecurity threat target, understand what we've been doing. And one of the key aspects of this is that bottom point, points of aggregation. As we move forward and understand that the threat, we have to understand that companies or that operate in the different countries operate differently. James, I think is this somebody wanting to talk or somebody joining?
No, I'm just letting Penny in to the session.
Okay. All right, no worries. So when we take a look at that, companies operate differently. Their political construct is different. The look at private industry is different, and we have to understand this. These are reports from the Wall Street Journal. These are reports from the country, but we know nation states operate differently based off that nation state mentality. Whether you own it as a private enterprise in capitalism within the United States, or whether it operates differently, like some countries allow bribery, which we have laws against, just like China and Russia have different laws that judge them being a nation state and going forward. Next slide. So trying to see which one comes up. We're skipping slides. So James has mentioned this, but this is about Industry 4.0 and what are we using here? The impact of what can be done has been seen. And that, as we know, you look at the power grid, Tennessee Valley Authority, or our constructs, Those use cyber physical systems that have human machine interfaces. But then you look at MERS, that also is a global supply chain that still uses different CPSs within their construct, and something can start there that moves across. Next slide. So the importance of that, and as we pointed out, is of course these cyber physical systems, this was tracked in 2011. It's good for you to see the site and where you can pull this information. Why? But the importance of this is it was a utility construct. They were able to track the IP address at that time. This is where I bring up the difference between warfare and crime. At the time, it's looked and traced as a Russian IP. What do we look at? We say, oh, well, that's an individual crime. It's an individual action. Next slide. Well, my whole thing is, was that cyber reconnaissance? Was that now attempt to see how you can disrupt? Because now if you move on with the different control systems, it happens again. But now it's a more progressive thing. Keep going, James. So these particular slides are giving you what we found from SANS now. Now, my aspect of this is nothing new. This is what we've seen. But where was that education piece? Where was the piece now that you're educating the human in the loop? Where's that piece that you take from what we've done? And is this still a precursor to seeing if we testing our resources, or is it information operations where now we losing faith and confidence in our ability to secure our borders in our systems? That's where I talk about the integration from crime to warfare. Because is this nation state based? We saw the activities that took place during the presidential elections. So we know that the influence on our national politics changes that from an act of crime to a potential act of warfare dealing with, and if it was a company, is that espionage to get a particular benefit. Next slide. So when you look at these systems, it's not only infracritical structure or critical structure that's known. We need to take these lessons learned, because these water pumps also are guidance for what? Oil pumps. And so you see the activity and you see the progression. Next slide. Yeah, this just gives you an example of a local and of the attempts of people to massage and manipulate, and how they can go all the way down to a local level. And you can look this up as well. But this is where we give the example and the reason why we put it on here from July 2009. So there's been a steady increase. Next slide. This is the espionage particular aspects, right? However, the reason why I bring this up is because now, if you look at that last line, right? The diesel engines that could detect when they were being tested, changing the performance according to improved results. The key aspect is money, cyber payload. Not just espionage here. Is this something now that we're testing, or that, well, because we trust somewhat Volkswagen and they paid for their crime, right? Tried to make the change. But now I want you to move this over for a nation state that could actually have have the same kind of device, but now it's going against our weapon system, where when it's cross-checked for our performance capability on our weapon system platform, can it then change the performance and give those data and results out? The art of the possible. Next slide, please. So James talked about this, but the evolution of itself in the supply chain, the key role for this piece is that we're moving more toward an industry 4.0 atmosphere, where there's more dependency upon our weapon system platforms, touching these different platforms, as well as having the communications. And my standpoint, in the way that I operate, we can no longer infuse security with air gap, infuse security with a lack of having an understanding of how these things are integrated and what part do they play. When I say integration, horizontal and vertical. Vertical integration within a software piece being built or a hardware piece being built. And then how does that horizontally integrate when you have across that program management piece, how they're integrating for it to become a weapon system platform. Next slide. So when you take these things under consideration, that's where you might have contracting play the pieces for. This is where I talked about the Lexmark, and having an understanding of some of those financials behind it is a key part of that financial risk lens. James and I talked about different things because unlike the private sector, when it comes to DOD, because certain things are downward directed, you're going to have different means that you're going to have to go out and look at the primes and the subs and their tiers as well to have an understanding of what is going on. So it could be triggers, just like you had, GitLab, James, GitHub,
GitLab.
GitLab was brought out. A lot of the source code that was being used in the development, GitLab owned. Well, GitLab was brought out by China. Now, all of a sudden, a lot of the things that was used to build some of that, what we call white box, gray box, and black box. White box being open source, gray box being maybe it's COTS, maybe government add-on, or totally black box, right? Where everything was done by the contractor, and they said, trust me. Next slide. This is where we get into that. No, we don't trust. Zero trust, but verify. And so when you get into that, and we'll cover it later, this is just about MRSC and showing how that proliferation can happen.
Okay, John, I'm gonna move forward to like bill of materials.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to get to. Please do. So the thing is, as he's scoping forward, one of the things that we're doing is showing you how a lot of different things communicate, and this is what I go through. Go to the bill of materials, though. Yeah. So that's fine. I can you start there, James, and then we'll just start there, and I'll go quickly through these next ones. Okay. All right. So we'll cover CBOM. Yeah, next slide, please. So I let you read this. When you're looking at bills of materials, this is going to allow you to have an understanding of what is going or what is being added. The bill of materials now that we're looking at is going to be trigger points from which you can pull your different risk lenses and initial piece of the reporting mechanism that our government is starting to put in place. Next slide. Why is this important? Because it is going to allow you to understand that lineage. We're going to talk about Providence, Pedigree, traceability, chain of custody. What do those things mean and how they apply to your life cycle? Next slide. So as you're doing that, you're going to be able to have an understanding. NTIA, and this was currently put out, 2021. I'll let you read this. Right? But a formal record, key part, executive downplay to the developers, right? This way, it can support the efforts that you're putting in place so that you can understand exactly where these parts and materials came from. But you're going to have some leeway as you're writing these to say, what must I have? Next slide. Because of that, well, James, go down one more slide, please, and then we'll come back to this. So here are the potential elements of how this operates, right? Same docket, same understanding, same information, but this gives you a set of the data fields that it's looking for. This is a baseline minimum elements that they're designating. You, on the other hand, being involved in that supply chain, have an understanding what you need to either push up that will help your maintenance guys to have a better feel for that information going into your system so you can maintain it and it can act as triggers. Or you, if you're in the early stages of RD&T, here's some of the things we're going to need for you to write or have as a part of the contract construct that comes out that allows the hardware, software people to do their due diligence. James, if you go back up, you can feel free to explain the other one as quickly as you like.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know we got about 5 minutes left, a few minutes. This is a good snapshot of what it's like to kind of manage and evaluate your bill of materials. And I like to use kind of the medical field because they have so many different outlets and points. But really, what you want to try to capture is, you see in the center is you want to kind of look at the identifier in your coding or your software that's going to be deployed and where it's coming from. So we see GitHub, RPM, App Store, we can identify with those things. But if you see something on there that's alarming, like GitLab, who sold their license to China, then we want to say, hey, hold on, this is, this could be malicious. We need to kind of do a deeper dive in it. But how this blooms out is into the critical areas that you need to look in, and then the sub-critical components of each of those areas. So you're looking at vulnerability analysis, you want to look at the expiration date, the protocols, the common names within the code itself. Of course, you want to look at privacies and disclosures. You want to look at all of these things. You look at supply chain integrity. You want to check sums. You want to do digital signatures, especially that's important with the development of blockchain technology and smart contracts. And so this is to give you an example of the depth of work that's required to kind of evaluate SBOM, but the steps needed and what you should be looking for to kind of give you the awareness of, okay, these are the things that are coming into my network. These are the potential risks that are imposed. How can I protect myself, and how I can be aware of where my source is coming from. So kind of that provenance piece that John talked about, that chain of custody, that the ownership, what is the marriage between the vendor in this source code that they're providing, and is it legit and safe? So I think that's running us right at 10:30.
There's
JD.
a couple of things that I need for them to see though, James.
Okay.
Can you go to the slide sorter so I can point it out if it's still in there? And then I'll turn it over to you, JD, because it's important for them to have this as part of their conversation. Go up a little bit, James. Let me see if this is a set of slides. Click on no, go down, please. Behind the SCP slide, it is slide 32. Click on slide 32. Okay, this piece I'm gonna leave with you guys. These are some of the definitions of Providence and Pedigree. Right? This is, and the reason why I mention it, this is, like I said, a draft, but this is coming out. James and I talk about chain of custody, traceability, but Providence and Pedigree, this is a definition of how things are going to be looking, because you're looking at the background and lineage, and it'll allow you to have a conversation. Remember, lexicons are important. We've had this problem within the cyber community because many people try to talk about many different things. What I'm trying to do now is keep you with the ability to have a good discussion so that you're on the same level of having that discussion about the Providence and Pedigree. Another thing that I'd like to give you, James, if you can click. No, not that one. I mean, with the slides, please. No, we're rushing, but go down. Yeah, go down. Yep. So go to slide 60, please. And this is go up one, James. I'm sorry. So one of the things that you guys need to remember when we talk in C-Scrum, there's a zero trust model that we talk about. Zero trust is still being worked, but that allows us to get into what do we have concerns about, because you have to make that from a stakeholder's perspective. Next slide. So when you're looking at that zero trust, there are going to be software parameters that are being defined. This is also one of the working groups that I'm working in. But you can define the security perimeter. And so those different aspects of what comes up pertaining to that security perimeter are going to then allow you to have some of those physical attributes that you're going to look at within your risk lens, financial attributes, cybersecurity attributes, and how do you set that off as triggers for what you're developing within your system. Next slide. So if you're doing that, now what you have is an integrated approach where you can actively deter, detect, because even though I have a threat to an automated vehicle, you could have weapon system platform there. Next slide. Because you want to do a functional decomposition, right? And that functional decomposition will allow you to determine what your security purposes are when you're in the operational community, and then how do you wish to secure it from the R&D through the maintenance cycle and where that supply chain takes effect. I wanted to give them some more ISO standards and things to look at, James, but I think we're cut for time. So,
Yeah.
all right.